Imagine me getting an invitation to speak at a conference of low-carb diet influencers, some of whom advocate a carnivore diet. It reminded me of a Sesame Street episode.
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other?
I feel like one of those things that doesn't belong. That's because I advocate plant-dominant diets like Mediterranean, Asian, vegetarian, and vegan, and those diets are rarely low-carb. Eager to share my point of view with respect at the conference, I wanted to know my audience, so I listened to the super popular carnivore doctor, Ken Berry.
If you ask any paleoanthropologist, they're like, well, yeah, we're basically effectively super carnivore. 70% of our food comes from animals, and it has for 2.5 million years.
I had never heard that before, and I happened to be on my way to meet the super famous paleoanthropologist Daniel Lieberman in his office. Dr. Lieberman's books are fascinating, and I recommend them to everyone because he talks about sitting, diet, exercise, and how our ancestors evolved. Other books I've read and loved by paleoanthropologists are Evolution's Bite, a story of teeth, diet, and human origins by Peter Ungar, Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human by Richard Wrangham, Burn by Herman Pontzer, and this beautiful book by Alice Roberts, which I had to buy a paper copy of because the artwork inside is just so amazing. Don't you think this guy had to be the Brad Pitt of his day? I was in Dr. Lieberman's office because he's giving a talk on exercise at the longevity conference I'm organizing for TED. But before I left, I asked if my friend Miguel and I could ask him a few questions about his books. His office, by the way, is in the amazing Peabody Museum of Paleoarchaeology at Harvard. I thought it would be pretty ironic if we sat for the interview, so we stood. I have questions. Sitting. What'd you ever conclude in your book on sitting?
Well, sitting is something that we, I think, unfairly demonize. All animals sit. Dogs sit, moose sit, chickens sit, and humans sit. And there's this kind of myth that goes around that today people sit ridiculous amounts of time and it's the new smoking and our chairs are out to kill us and all that. And it is true. If you don't get physical activity, that can cause, increase your risk of all kinds of diseases. But hunter-gatherers sit just as much as Americans, right? Typical hunter-gatherer in Tanzania sits about 10 hours a day.
But they squat for a couple hours a day, right?
They do. When they sit, so there are differences, right? So how they sit is different. So it's the way that we sit that's actually the problem, right? And so we tend to sit in a very inert fashion. We sit in chairs that have backs. Our sitting requires essentially no energy. And furthermore, we tend to sit for really long, uninterrupted periods, right? Whereas if you go to non-Western societies where chairs aren't ubiquitous, people tend to squat, so they're engaging their leg muscles. They don't have backrest, so they're engaging some of their back muscles, and that turns like their muscles on a little bit, right? They're doing a little bit of something. It's like turning your car on, even if you're not driving, and it engages the engine, right? And in addition, Americans, people in the West, tend to sit for long, uninterrupted periods, for several hours at a time, right? Sitting there staring into a computer or watching TV. But in traditional societies, people tend to get up about every 10 to 15 minutes. And again, that turns on it's like turning on the engine. So it's not that we sit so much, it's that we sit so much for long, uninterrupted periods. And that is what causes, increases in inflammation, increases the blood sugar levels, increases fat levels in our blood. All of that amounts to damage.
So I'm about to tell on you because I'm in your office here at Harvard, and I see your chair. And you don't have a stand-up desk, and you're not sitting on a beanbag.
I do have a stand-up desk.
Oh, you do?
Yes, my desk goes up and down.
Oh, that's how it works. Oh, I see. Oh, it does. Oh, I'm busted.
But I don't see a Bosu ball, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not religious about it. And look, there's no evidence that stand-up desks are necessarily bad for you. I mean, one of the things that's, if you look at the epidemiological data, it's actually not work time sitting that's associated with poor health outcomes. It's leisure time sitting.
Oh, really?
So if you spend all your day sitting at work, and then you also drive to get to work, and then when you get home, you drive home to get after work, and then you spend the rest of the evening sitting in a couch or etc. watching TV, then you're in trouble. But the evidence is that people who go to work and they sit at their desk for 7-8 hours a day, but then engage in some other kinds of activity, there's no real evidence that they're causing that much harm. So I think we should stop unfairly demonizing sitting. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. Let's just sit better, right? Sit more actively and interrupt our sitting more frequently.
I heard a nephrologist say, when you're on an airplane, don't sit for more than an hour without walking up and down the aisle, because the kidneys have poor circulation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why by getting up and moving every once in a while, your kidneys, your venous system, there are no, return to your blood to your heart requires muscles to pump it, right? So your blood pools in your legs, for example. Muscles, even just, getting up and just doing, getting a cup of tea or going to the bathroom can turn on your muscles and turn all kinds of genes in your muscles. We don't even know exactly what they're doing. So just, again, just, it's okay to sit. Don't be scared about sitting, but if you do sit, get up every once in a while.
So a lot of longevity books with regard to exercise talk about resistance training and balance. But isn't there data coming out now that things like racket sports are even better for longevity? Tennis, have you lived long, soccer and so on? Because, I don't know why, maybe because they're social, maybe because they're fun, maybe because they add coordination. You mentioned a few of these things in your book, but I didn't hear you mention types of exercise for longevity.
Yeah, because trying to relate a particular exercise to longevity is pretty complicated, right? For example, people who play tennis also tend to be richer than people who don't play tennis. So that's a kind of dangerous game. Right? It's hard to do that. But I would say that, look, we know that the bedrock of physical activity is aerobic physical activity, aerobic exercise, or what we call cardio, right? That's important for your cardiovascular system. It's important for metabolism. It's important for your brain. It's important for all kinds of things. But, weights are also important, right? Especially as we age. That keeps your muscles strong. It prevents frailty, prevents this vicious cycle of sarcopenia when your muscles start losing mass and then you become less active and then you do less of everything. So look, there's some mix of aerobic physical activity and resistance physical activity that are important for health. But it's not a medicine. We tend to medicalize exercise and run into trouble, right? Because, what are you worried about? Are you worried about cancer? Are you worried about heart disease? Are you worried about Alzheimer's? Are you worried about, type 2 diabetes? Are you young? Are you old? Do you have a limp in your leg? I mean, there's no one recipe. There's no one medicine. There's no one, dose that has a determined effect. The simple answer is that some exercise is better than none. More is better up to a certain point, and then there's really no extra added benefit. And you got to mix it up and do it as long as you're alive, right? Don't ever stop being physically active, because as we get older, physical activity becomes, if anything, more important, not less important. But, trying to figure out what's the optimal dose and the optimal exercise, I don't think that's a really sensible way of it. That's medicalizing exercise, and I don't think that's very healthy.
Fascinating. So I was listening to some carnivores.
These are carnivorous humans, you mean?
Yeah, well, modern carnivores.
Not wolves.
Right. Yeah, no, okay. They just eat beef. Humans who eat beef, and say it's the perfect optimal diet, the only true diet. So they say that every paleontologist in the world, they say this emphatically, every paleoanthropologist in the world agrees that we evolved eating meat for the last 2 million years. It's our evolutionary diet, and we're crazy if we don't make our diets all meat. What do you say?
Well, it's true that we evolved to eat meat, and in some parts of the world, people ate actually a lot of meat. Like, for example, in Arctic environments, right? There's not a lot of food to eat other than meat, right? But if you look at tropical hunter-gatherers, I think about 30% of their calories comes from meat. So let's not exaggerate how much meat our ancestors ate. Secondly, the meat that they ate is very different from the meat that we tend to eat today, right? Wild game has much less saturated fat, and it's just healthier.
It probably matters what humans ate a long time ago. That probably matters a lot. And so I really started to read in the archaeological literature, and then later the anthropological literature, and then later the paleoanthropological literature. And that's when it became self-evident to me, as self-evident as it is to all paleoanthropological researchers, is that from the beginning of our species, about 300,000 years ago, we have eaten as much fatty meat as we could get our hands on. And so there's this principle in biology. I was I had my undergraduate in animal biology. So there's this principle called adaptation. And so what that word means in biology is when a species has been doing something for a long damn time, so millions and millions of years, that species has adapted to that. And not only can they tolerate it, they've learned to actually optimize on that.
And finally, I think the biggest problem with this argument is that just because our ancestors evolved to do something doesn't mean it's healthy. That's what we call a paleo fantasy, right? We evolved for one reason and one reason only, right? To have, as far as evolution is concerned, is to have as many offspring as possible. And evolution doesn't care if we get heart disease when we're in our 60s or cancer in our 70s or whatever, because you've already had your children by then, right? So the argument that you should eat something because your ancestors did it is really just silly. I mean, I can't think of any other term, right? I mean, our ancestors also didn't sleep on mattresses, so are they going to give up their mattresses? Our ancestors didn't brush their teeth. Our ancestors, didn't have refrigeration or antibiotics or vaccines. I mean, this is a shallow way of thinking, and and if you also look at the epidemiological data, there's just no way around it. Vegetarians live longer than people who eat a lot of meat.
So what do you think of the Arctic populations who have a mutation in their genes so they can't go into ketosis?
So it's true. There's been selection in enzymes that desaturate certain fats that are more common in Arctic populations. So there's been selection for them to tolerate diets that are low in carbohydrates. Most of us don't have those adaptations, so I don't know why that really matters for most of us. In addition, it's also been claimed that Arctic populations had very low levels of heart disease. That comes from some old, really bad studies. If you look at actually recent studies that have, really look hard at all the data, the evidence is that Arctic populations had pretty much the same level of heart disease as Westerners who are eating, typical Western diet. So this idea that, a high saturated fat diet protects you from heart disease is a myth. It's unfounded. It's based on no serious, solid evidence.
What would you recommend to the average person when it comes to exercise for each week? What kind of goals should they have?
You're medicalizing it.
All right. Well, again, this is the medicalization of exercise, the prescription, that it's a medicine. There's a dose, there's a type. I think the most important thing, since most people, only 20% of Americans get enough exercise, right? I mean, by enough exercise, we're talking about a very, very moderate level, 150 minutes a week, which is 21 minutes a day of walking, right? So I think, for the vast majority of people out there, it's just anything, right? Anything that you can do that you'll enjoy, right? And for most people, reason I titled my book Exercised is that people get exercised about exercise, right? They get stressed, they feel judged, they feel like they're being told they're lazy or there's something wrong with them, right? The best physical activity is actually not exercise, it's just something you enjoy doing. So find something that you like to do, that you find rewarding, find some way to make it a necessary part of your life. And the more you do, the better, up to a certain point. I mean, at a certain, if you do, run Ironmans or, triathlons or whatever, it's not going to really benefit you any more than, just some moderate level. But I think that's the most important thing. So find what you like to do and then, then mix it up and don't stop, right? And good physical activity, especially as we age, should involve, some weights, something that exercises, your muscles in your body, helps strengthen them so that you avoid muscle loss. Because sarcopenia, the wasting away of muscles as people age, is a really terrible condition. But that's the bad news. The good news is it's a very avoidable condition simply by twice a week is what the recommendation is, doing some kind of weight training.
So do we have an understanding of how exercise affects our lifespans? Is that something that we have enough data to say somebody that exercises this much lives this much longer, or is that not really something that we have an understanding of?
It's really hard to do that, right? Because you don't know how long somebody is going to live if they didn't exercise, right? So it's much easier, and so most of the data look at the relative risk of mortality at a given age. That's really the best kind of data that we have, right? We can say that if you don't exercise versus you exercise, how much more likely are you to die at a given age, right? And that's really where the data comes from. To translate that into years lived, turns out to be a very tricky calculation. So what we can really say is, people who get moderate levels of physical activity lower their age-related risk of mortality by, 30% or more, right? And that translates into longer health span, right? Because they're less likely to get heart disease, they're less likely to get diabetes, they're less likely to get cancers, they're less likely to get Alzheimer's and dementia and all kinds of other chronic diseases that not only decrease the quality of life, but also shorten your life. But translating that into a number of years, that's really hard. And the other reason it's very hard to do that is because of medicine, right? There is no experiment where we can, imagine the experiment you need to do, right? You need to get a bunch of people and have some of them not exercise and not get any medical care and find out how much less they lived, right? We're not going to do that, right? There are no populations where we can independently measure the effects of exercise without the confounding effect of medicine, which keeps people alive for longer.
Now, there's a big trend when it comes to the current athletics, like I'm thinking CrossFit and bodybuilding, where people are putting themselves to the brink of exhaustion. And but if you look at these other populations that have lived a long time, they were moving a lot, but they weren't necessarily moving to that extent. Do we have an understanding of how this moving to exhaustion affects us long term?
Yeah, another way of asking that question is, can you exercise too much? And there's not a lot of data on that because there's so few people who do that, right? Epidemiologically, that's still a tiny, small number, right? But even so, if you look at the numbers, so for example, there was a study done in the United Kingdom, the UK Biobank study, which looked at this. And they looked at people who did like ultramarathons and various other kinds of extreme levels of physical activity. They do better than people who are sedentary, but they don't seem to do any better than people who are sort of moderately active. But also there's no evidence that it's actually harmful, right? So again, I would say that the evidence is that, some exercise is way better than none. And eventually the benefits tail off. And so, you don't need to swim marathons or climb the, Mount Everest or, swim the Eiffel, the British English Channel or whatever to get the benefits of exercise. You do that for other reasons, probably because you're, like me, obsessed and impulsive, and you just, it's better than, being on a psychiatrist's couch or something like that. But it's not really going to make you that much better.
But you are an advocate of high intensity exercise, like once a week or something.
Sure, absolutely. Again, it's part of mixing it up, right? Again, we didn't evolve to do one kind of thing, and I think again that's not a recipe for health and fitness, but different kinds of physical activity have different kinds of effects. So sometimes it's good to go long and slow. Sometimes it's good to do high intensity. Sometimes it's good to do weights. Sometimes it's good to jump. And there's again, mixing it up makes a lot of sense because the effects of physical activity are diverse, and your body is complicated, right? So having different kinds of physical activities and doing cross training and all of that is makes a lot of sense, and the evidence also supports that. Mixing it up tends to bring more benefits than doing just only one kind of exercise.
For women that are of childbearing years, I should say, is there evidence on limits that they should be putting in place when it comes to the way they exercise?
Yeah, I don't really know.
That could affect their fertility or...
So in terms of fertility, look, if especially women who exercise at really high levels, they're spending a lot of energy, and they often tend to have less body fat, and body fat actually is an important source of estrogen. And so there's a condition called REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. It used to be called female athlete triad syndrome, but we've sort of expanded the definition. And so very high levels of exercise, especially when associated with disordered eating or not enough food intake, can lead to trouble, especially in women, right? It can also affect men too, but more so in women.
They miss their monthly cycles, right?
Yes, so they don't have enough estrogen to have healthy, normal menstrual cycles, so they're often amenorrheic. The low levels of estrogen affect the skeleton, so they tend to have higher levels of bone breakage. There's a whole series of effects that come from this combination of not eating enough and exercising too much.
What would constitute a high level of activity in that case?
Again, it's a combination of these. It's about negative energy balance, right? I mean, if you eat enough and you exercise a lot, theoretically you should be okay, right? So it's really about the relationship between what goes in and what goes out over long periods of time. So it's a complex story, right? And I think we need to pay attention to it. And a lot of young athletes, especially young women athletes, are pushed to keep their body weight down, do extreme levels of exercise, because a runner who weighs less, or a gymnast who weighs less, right, can do more, or do more somersaults or whatever it is they do, right? But that can take a toll on their bodies. And so I think we need to take a serious look in the mirror about how we push young people for sports. We're not talking about exercise, we're talking about extreme sports and what the health consequences of that are.
That's great. Thank you so much.
One of my grad students is doing a PhD on this.